The one who destroyed me did not know I became the person they fear most. Evelyn Shaw learned what public destruction felt like at 9:17 on a Thursday morning, under the white corporate lights of the 32nd floor conference hall, with a wall of glass behind her and 48 people sitting in curved rows in front of her, every face turned toward the screen where her name had been placed beneath words that did not belong beside it. Fraud, misconduct, internal breach. The letters were clean, black, and professional, which somehow made them more violent than shouting. Nobody in the room screamed. Nobody gasped loudly enough to be remembered later. The people at Northbridge Strategic Group were too polished for that. They knew how to perform shock with stillness, how to let silence become an execution chamber, how to look at someone with just enough sadness to pretend they had not already chosen a side. Evelyn stood near the end of the long table with a folder in her hands, and felt the warmth leave her fingers one joint at a time. She had been called into the meeting thinking she was presenting the final risk analysis for the Vesper account, the largest client acquisition the firm had pursued in 5 years. She had spent 9 months building that strategy, cleaning corrupted projections, correcting unrealistic growth assumptions, and warning senior leadership that the deal contained hidden liabilities. She had said the same thing again and again in quiet rooms, in emails, in marked-up slides, in one-on-one conversations where people nodded and then walked away pretending not to have heard her. Now the screen showed a different story. It showed her name attached to manipulated spreadsheets, unauthorized file transfers, and altered client assumptions. It showed a timeline so precise that it looked undeniable. It showed a villain constructed from pieces of her own work. Adrian Cole stood beside the screen with the grave expression of a man mourning a disaster he had carefully designed. He wore a charcoal suit, a silver watch, and the kind of calm authority people trusted because they confused composure with honesty. Adrian was late 30s or early 40s, depending on the lighting and the source of the rumor, but he carried himself with the polished confidence of someone who had never entered a room without first measuring how to own it. He was not the loudest executive at Northbridge, not the most obviously ruthless, and that was why he was dangerous. He spoke softly. He remembered birthdays. He praised people in public just enough to make them hungry for more. He never needed to threaten directly, because he had mastered the art of making people fear disappointing him. Evelyn had once admired that about him. She had mistaken control for discipline, charm for intelligence, and attention for mentorship. That morning, while her career bled out on a screen behind him, she finally understood the difference. "We take no pleasure in this," Adrian said, his voice pitched low enough to sound reluctant, and Evelyn noticed how several people immediately leaned forward, as if his sorrow required their participation. "Evelyn has contributed meaningful work here. That is why this is difficult, but the evidence we have reviewed is extensive, and the consequences to the firm could have been severe." Could have been. The phrase settled in her mind. He was not saying she had damaged the company. He was saying she could have. A carefully chosen phrase, broad enough to frighten the board, vague enough to avoid specifics, polished enough to survive scrutiny. Evelyn's eyes moved from the slide to the people seated in the room. There was Mara from compliance, looking down at her notes. David from finance, jaw clenched, avoiding her gaze. Nora, who had borrowed Evelyn's umbrella last month and promised lunch, now staring at the table as though eye contact might infect her. At the back stood Lena Brooks, Evelyn's closest friend in the company, her face pale and rigid, her hands clasped so tightly at her waist that her knuckles had gone white. Lena looked like she wanted to move, to speak, to cross the room, but she was trapped inside the same machinery as everyone else. The machinery had already decided. Evelyn opened her mouth, and the first sound that came out was not a defense but a breath. She hated that. She hated that her body betrayed even that much. "Those files were not modified by me," she said, and her voice sounded smaller than it had in her head. "The Vesper projections I submitted flagged those risks. There are version histories. There are email chains. If you check the original folder on the restricted drive, you'll see that the data in this deck is not mine." Adrian turned toward her slowly, not with anger but with disappointment. That was worse. Anger could be challenged. Disappointment made the room feel like a parent had arrived. "Evelyn," he said gently, and she felt the humiliation sharpen because he used her name as if they were alone, as if this were a private intervention rather than a public dismantling. "We did check the drive. That is why we are here." He clicked to the next slide. Access logs, her employee ID, timestamps, file exports, an approval trail that ended with her initials. She stared at the screen while her mind moved faster than her fear. The timestamps were wrong. Not random wrong, but constructed wrong. 2 of them were placed at times she had been in meetings with no laptop open. One was during the network outage 3 weeks earlier. Another showed a file export from her workstation at 11:43 p.m., a time when she knew she had been in a taxi coming home from the airport after the Denver client review. She remembered because she had spilled coffee on her coat and texted Lena a photo. But remembering was not proof. Not here, not now, not in front of people who had already accepted the story, because accepting it was easier than questioning the man presenting it. I was not logged in at those times, she said. Adrian's face softened further, almost tenderly, and she saw what he was doing. He was making her sound unstable without saying the word. I understand this is overwhelming. HR will walk you through the process privately. Privately, Evelyn repeated before she could stop herself, and that one word carried enough bitterness to make several people shift in their seats. The HR director, Ms. Reynolds, cleared her throat from the far end of the table. She was a practical woman with sharp glasses and a voice that rarely carried emotion. Evelyn, effective immediately, you are suspended pending final review. Given the seriousness of the findings and the client exposure involved, your system access has already been revoked. Already, the word hit like a second accusation. They had locked her out before she entered the room. They had not invited her to answer. They had invited her to witness the burial. Adrian stepped back, giving HR the floor, but not before he allowed his eyes to meet Evelyn's for one brief second. There was something in that look nobody else would have noticed. Not triumph exactly. Triumph was too obvious. It was certainty. The quiet satisfaction of a man watching a door close from the correct side. He believed she would break. He believed the room, the evidence, the shame, the loss, and the sheer weight of institutional power would reduce her to a cautionary story people whispered about for 3 weeks before moving on. He had chosen the setting carefully. Company-wide leadership meeting, client risk context, senior witnesses, no chance for private contradiction, no space for dignity. Security escorted her out 23 minutes later. They did not touch her. They did not need to. 2 men in navy jackets walked 3 paces behind her as she carried a cardboard box that someone from facilities had produced with frightening efficiency. Her badge no longer opened the glass doors. Her laptop had been taken before she could touch it. Her desk had been searched while she was in the meeting, and the drawers were already open when she arrived. People watched from behind monitors, door frames, and half-closed blinds. Some looked ashamed. Some looked curious. A few looked relieved, because when someone else becomes the disaster, everyone else gets to remain safe for another day. Jason from Analytics mouthed something that might have been sorry. Evelyn did not answer. She placed her mug, 2 notebooks, a framed photo of her mother, and a small ceramic fox Lena had given her into the box. Her hands moved steadily. That steadiness disturbed people more than tears would have. She could feel it. They wanted a collapse. They wanted proof that the accusation had reached her. They wanted visible pain to complete the narrative. At the elevator, Lena appeared suddenly, breathless, as if she had slipped out between calls. Ev, she whispered, and the nickname almost broke something open inside Evelyn. I don't believe this. I don't. I swear to you, I don't. One of the security guards shifted. Evelyn looked at Lena and saw fear, loyalty, helplessness, and a question she could not ask in public. Evelyn wanted to say everything at once. She wanted to say Adrian did this. She wanted to say check the timestamps. She wanted to say I need you to remember every detail. Instead she said, do not message me from your company account. Lena's eyes widened slightly. Evelyn saw understanding arrive. Not fully, but enough. The elevator doors opened. Evelyn stepped inside with the box held against her ribs. Adrian stood at the far end of the hallway, speaking quietly to Ms. Reynolds, his posture grave, his eyes lowered, every inch the leader forced to make a painful decision. Just before the doors closed, he looked up. For half a second, the mask loosened. Evelyn saw the truth beneath it, not rage, not fear, not remorse, only calculation, already moving on to the next room, the next advantage. the next person who could be used and discarded. The doors closed. The elevator descended. Evelyn did not scream. She did not fight back. That was the moment the old version of her began to die. Evelyn did not cry until she reached her apartment, and even then the tears did not come dramatically. She set the cardboard box on the kitchen counter, removed her coat, folded it over a chair, washed her hands, and stood beneath the cold fluorescent light above her sink, while her phone began vibrating with messages she could not answer. News traveled fast in industries built on reputation. By noon, 3 people had asked if she was okay. By 1, 2 had stopped replying. By 3, a recruiter who had once called her a rising star wrote that he hoped the situation resolved, but that his clients were very sensitive to compliance concerns. At 5:30, her mother called after seeing a vague post from someone who should have known better. Evelyn let it go to voicemail. She could not bear to make her voice sound normal. At 8:12 p.m., she sat on the bathroom floor with her back against the tub, still in her blouse and work slacks, her knees pulled to her chest. Her apartment was silent except for the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. She had always been disciplined. Disciplined enough to work late without complaint. Disciplined enough to take notes when others improvised. Disciplined enough to be useful, reliable, precise. But discipline did not protect her from a narrative designed by someone more powerful. Discipline had made her easier to exploit. That realization hurt more than the firing. It made the last 3 years rearrange themselves in her mind. Every compliment from Adrian, every closed-door conversation, every project he had asked her to prepare and then presented without her, every time he had said, "You understand the substance better than anyone, Evelyn, and that's why I need you focused behind the scenes." Behind the scenes, invisible, contained. Her phone lit again. Lena, this time from a personal number. "I saved what I could from my side. I don't know what happened, but I know you. Don't disappear." Evelyn stared at the message until the screen went dark. "This is where I'm supposed to disappear," she whispered into the bathroom silence, and the words frightened her because they felt possible. Not death, not exactly, but a disappearance of identity. No job, no references, no access, no professional standing. Adrian had not just taken her position. He had made her name poisonous. For 12 days, Evelyn lived inside the aftermath like a sealed room with no windows. Her professional email was gone. Her company laptop was gone. Her building access was gone. Her name remained, but altered, as though people no longer knew how to use it without lowering their voices. She applied to jobs with the desperate restraint of someone trying not to look desperate, and silence answered. One hiring manager postponed a call indefinitely. Another asked directly whether there were ongoing legal or reputational concerns connected to her previous employer. A former colleague who had once praised her analytical instincts stopped typing mid-message and never replied. The world did not need a court ruling to convict her. It only needed uncertainty. Lena came over on the 13th day with soup Evelyn did not want, and a bag of groceries she had not asked for. She found Evelyn at the kitchen table surrounded by printed resumes, rejection emails, and unopened mail. Evelyn had showered, dressed, and arranged herself into a version of functionality, but Lena saw too much. She always had. "You look like you've been sleeping with your eyes open," Lena said softly. "I've been sleeping enough." "No, you haven't." Evelyn folded a rejection email into precise thirds. "Do not start caring so loudly. I don't have the energy to reassure you." Lena took the chair across from her. "Then don't reassure me. Just let me sit here." They sat for a while without speaking. Outside, rain moved against the windows in thin, restless lines. Evelyn looked at Lena's hands. There was a paper cut near her thumb. She wondered why she noticed things like that now, why the mind clung to details when the larger structure had collapsed. Finally, Lena opened her bag and took out a small drive. She placed it on the table between them. "I shouldn't have this." Evelyn did not touch it. "What is it?" "Calendar exports, meeting notes, some copies of old thread summaries, nothing directly from your restricted files, because I wasn't stupid enough to steal those, but enough to show you were in meetings during some of the timestamps they used." Evelyn looked at the drive, then at Lena. "You could lose your job for this." "I know." "Then why?" Lena's expression hardened. "Because everyone is pretending not to know, and I hate them for it." Something inside Evelyn shifted again, quieter than gratitude and sharper than hope. "Did Adrian ask about me?" Lena looked away, and that was answer enough. "Tell me." He held a meeting, said the company would move forward with integrity and transparency. He said your case was a reminder that talent without ethics is dangerous. Evelyn smiled. It was not a warm expression. Lena flinched slightly. He said that. Yes, good, good. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. He's getting comfortable. That night after Lena left, Evelyn plugged the drive into an old laptop that had never touched Northbridge systems. She reviewed the calendar exports slowly, meeting room bookings, video call attendance, travel records, timestamps that contradicted the logs shown in the conference room. The first crack was not dramatic. It was small, technical, and beautiful. At 11:43 p.m. on the night of the alleged export, Evelyn's company badge had been used to exit the building at 7:02 p.m., and she had a rideshare receipt from the airport at 11:39 p.m. The system logs said her workstation had exported a restricted financial package 4 minutes later. Her workstation, not her physical presence. Remote access, credential duplication, administrative override. She wrote each possibility in a notebook. Then she remembered something. 3 weeks before the meeting, the restricted drive had behaved strangely. Files reopening after she closed them. A permissions prompt flashing and disappearing. A folder named VSPtemp appearing for less than a minute in the shared directory before vanishing. At the time, she had dismissed it as IT maintenance. She had even messaged Adrian, seeing odd temp folders in the Vesper model directory. Do you know if TechOps is running something? His reply had been quick. Don't worry about it. I asked them to clean up old architecture. Stay focused on the client story. She opened her personal phone and searched screenshots. She had a habit of capturing odd system behavior because details mattered to her. There it was, a blurry image of the VSPtemp folder. Time-stamped. The username associated with the active session was partially visible in the file path. Not hers. A system admin root connected to executive analytics privileges. Who had executive analytics privileges on Vesper? Adrian. 2 others, but only Adrian had motive. The accusation had not been random. It had been planned, strategic, personal. Evelyn did not sleep that night. She built a timeline on the kitchen wall with painter's tape and index cards. Dates, meetings, file access, conversations, Adrian's remarks, her warnings, his corrections, the shift from praising her to isolating her. The week he stopped copying her on client emails. The day he asked her to send him raw model assumptions so he could protect her from executive noise. The night the temp folder appeared. The fabricated logs. The public meeting. At dawn, with the room pale and cold around her, she stood before the wall and saw the structure clearly. Adrian had not fired her because she failed. He had pushed her out because she knew the Vesper deal was contaminated, because her risk model threatened the acquisition bonus pool, because she had warned that if the firm presented inflated forecasts to investors, the damage would not be internal embarrassment but regulatory exposure. He had needed her gone before the deal closed. He had needed her discredited before she could speak. Evelyn pressed her palm against the wall beside his name. If I survive this, she said, her voice low and unfamiliar, I won't come back the same. Survival was ugly at first. It did not look like empowerment. It looked like deleting subscription services, negotiating rent deferral with a landlord who sounded sympathetic until the second month, selling a watch her father had given her when she graduated business school, and then sitting in a pawn shop parking lot with the receipt in her hand, unable to start the car for 10 minutes. It looked like wearing the same black blazer to 5 interviews and watching people recognize her name with the flicker of discomfort they tried to hide. It looked like panic at 3 a.m., like checking job boards with a dry mouth, like wondering whether Adrian had truly ended everything, and whether the smartest thing she could do was move cities, change industries, become someone smaller and easier to forget. One evening in late February, after a consultant role withdrew its offer without explanation, Evelyn sat on her apartment floor surrounded by documents and felt the first real temptation to give up. Not dramatically, not with collapses, just a quiet thought that maybe the fight would consume more than she had left. Her phone was across the room. Lena had texted twice. Evelyn had not answered. The wall timeline looked obsessive now, a shrine to something she could not prove strongly enough. Adrian still had his title, his network, his reputation. She had screenshots, fragments, contradictions, and a reputation already stained. She closed her eyes and imagined taking everything down, boxing the papers, throwing away the notes, letting the world keep its version. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. Evelyn Shaw, a male voice asked, "Yes, my name is Marcus Hale. I was given your number by Lena Brooks. She said you might be willing to talk." Evelyn sat up slowly. "About what?" "Adrian Cole." The name changed the air in the room. Marcus asked to meet in person, not over the phone, not by email, and Evelyn almost refused because caution had become her bloodstream. But Lena confirmed him. Former Northbridge advisor, pushed out 4 years earlier after a deal review went bad. Brilliant, difficult, disliked by people who preferred obedience. Evelyn agreed to meet him in a quiet hotel bar at 3 in the afternoon, a place where business travelers spoke softly and nobody stayed long enough to remember faces. Marcus Hale was in his early 60s, tall, spare, with silver hair and eyes that suggested he had spent a lifetime watching powerful people lie elegantly. He did not offer false warmth. He did not tell Evelyn he was sorry. He ordered black coffee, waited until the server left, and said, "Tell me what he did." Evelyn studied him. "You already have an idea." "I do. I want yours." She told him everything, not emotionally, but structurally, because emotion still felt dangerous in front of strangers. He listened without interrupting, occasionally writing a word in a small notebook. When she finished, he did not look surprised. "Adrian has done variations of this before," Marcus said. Evelyn's throat tightened. "To you, to me, and to others. He rarely repeats the same method. That's why he survives. With me, it was conflict of interest. With another analyst, it was leaked client material. With a junior director, it was misconduct framed as insubordination. He doesn't destroy everyone, only the ones positioned to expose him. Why didn't anyone stop him?" Marcus looked at her with something that might have been pity if it had not been so controlled. "Because companies do not fear corruption as much as they fear visible corruption. Adrian understands that difference. He gives institutions a cleaner story than the truth, and institutions love clean stories." Evelyn sat with that. The hotel bar seemed to dim around her, the soft clink of glassware distant and unreal. "Can he be stopped?" "Yes," Marcus said, "but not by demanding fairness. Fairness is a language people use when they lack leverage. You need leverage." "I have evidence." "You have beginnings." "Evidence becomes power only when it reaches the right people at the right moment, in the right sequence." Sequencer. The word locked into her mind. Marcus leaned forward. "If you want your name cleared, we build a case. If you want Adrian punished, we build a trap. Those are different projects." For the first time in months, Evelyn felt something close to heat behind her ribs, not hope, not anger exactly, but purpose beginning to harden into shape. "I don't just want my name cleared." Marcus nodded once, as if she had given the only acceptable answer. "Then we start with discipline. You will not contact him. You will not accuse him. You will not publish anything. You will not satisfy your pain with a premature strike. He believes you are broken. Let him keep believing that. It is the only advantage he has given you." Under Marcus, rebuilding did not feel inspirational. It felt like training for a war no one else could see. He made her reconstruct the case from scratch, not as the victim but as an opposing counsel, a regulator, a board member, a journalist, a hostile skeptic. Every claim required support. Every support required authentication. Every emotional conclusion had to be converted into a document, a date, a timestamp, a witness, a motive, a risk. He forced her to separate what she knew from what she could prove, and the distinction humiliated her at first, because it showed how much of her pain still lived outside usable form. Lena helped quietly, carefully, never stealing, never breaking rules in ways that would compromise the case, but remembering conversations, confirming meeting dates, identifying people who had been moved off projects after questioning Adrian. One name led to another. Mark Feld, former senior associate, now working in compliance training in Chicago. Priya Nair, who had left after a performance issue that looked suspiciously like retaliation. Evan Ross, who had once managed access controls before being transferred. Some refused to speak. Some spoke and then panicked. A few offered fragments. Marcus taught Evelyn to value fragments. Enough fragments made architecture. Spring became a season of disciplined invisibility. Evelyn stopped applying broadly and took contract work under a small advisory group Marcus recommended. Not glamorous, not high-paying at first, but enough to keep her afloat and enough to rebuild credibility outside Northbridge. She studied regulatory filing requirements at night. She learned how investor materials were archived, how audit logs could be spoofed but not perfectly erased, how metadata remained in exported PDFs, how administrative sessions created secondary traces even when primary logs were altered. She read case studies on corporate fraud, whistleblower protections, defamation strategy, governance failures, and executive misconduct investigations. She became fluent in the systems Adrian had used against her. Her transformation was not sudden. It happened in small losses. She stopped explaining herself to people committed to misunderstanding her. She stopped checking Adrian's public posts every morning, then eventually checked only on scheduled days. Not for pain, but for intelligence. She cut her hair shorter because the old length belonged to someone who had cried in bathrooms before difficult meetings, and then returned smiling. She bought one dark suit with money she should have saved and wore it to every important conversation until it felt like armor. She learned to let silence sit without rushing to fill it. She learned that appearing calm was useful, but being calm was better, and being cold was best when the room required precision. Adrian noticed later. He noticed because a deal stalled. Then another, a minor investor, asked a pointed question about Vesper assumptions during a private call. A partner firm requested additional documentation on data provenance. A compliance reviewer who had once accepted Northbridge's summaries without objection, suddenly asked for raw model lineage. None of it mentioned Evelyn. None of it looked coordinated. That was the point. Power in silence was not a fist. It was pressure applied through systems until the target began to feel reality tightening and could not locate the hand. Evelyn observed him through the public traces powerful people live when they believe themselves safe. Conference panels, investor quotes, executive announcements. Internal gossip Lena still heard, though carefully. Adrian had been promoted after the Vesper deal closed. Senior Managing Director, Strategic Growth. His photograph appeared on the company website, smiling with restrained confidence, the short bio praising his commitment to ethical leadership. Evelyn printed that page and placed it in a folder labeled Masks. Then came the hidden advantage. It arrived through Mark Feld, who had resisted 2 calls before agreeing to a third. He met Evelyn and Marcus in a rented conference room in Chicago with no windows and a coffee machine that burned everything it touched. Mark was thinner than his old employee photo, nervous and angry at himself for being nervous. "I don't want to be involved," he said before sitting. Marcus replied, "Then why are you here?" Mark looked at Evelyn. "Because he did it to me first." He brought a flash drive containing archived access control documentation from 4 years earlier. He had kept it because, as he put it, when someone rewrites your life, you keep receipts even if you don't know what to do with them. The files showed a pattern Adrian had used before: temporary administrative sessions routed through project leads, file modifications later attributed to lower-level employees, discrepancies dismissed as user error. But one file mattered more than the rest: a deleted memo recovered from an old backup, written by Adrian to an external consultant on the Vesper-adjacent financing structure. It referenced reframing risk ownership and preparing a personnel explanation if projection integrity is challenged. The wording was careful, but not careful enough. It predated Evelyn's firing by 2 months. Evelyn read it 3 times. Marcus watched her. "That is not the whole case." "No," she said, "but it is intent." Mark rubbed his face. "There's more. I heard Vesper wasn't the only one. Adrian has a side arrangement with a private investment group tied to clients Northbridge advises. I could never prove it." Marcus went very still. "Name?" "Caldwell Meridian." The name sounded ordinary. The structure behind it was not. Over the next month, Evelyn followed it through public filings, private conversations, and data. Marcus knew how to obtain legally through channels that felt almost invisible. Caldwell Meridian held positions that benefited when certain acquisition recommendations moved forward. Adrian had indirect ties through a Shell advisory vehicle, registered under a former business school classmate. It was not proof of a crime by itself, but combined with manipulated risk models, investor presentations, and internal suppression of dissent, it became something worse than career theft. It became corruption. Evelyn had wanted revenge. The case now demanded exposure. Marcus warned her then, "This is bigger than your reputation. If we move, we do not move emotionally. We move so that every person who protects him becomes afraid of being attached to him." How long? As long as it takes. So she waited. Waiting became the cruelest discipline. Adrian continued rising. He appeared on podcasts. He published an essay about resilient leadership. Northbridge announced him as keynote speaker for its annual Investor Strategy Summit in October, where he would present the firm's growth thesis and showcase Vesper as a model of disciplined acquisition intelligence. That was the day Marcus circled on the calendar. "He will be at peak visibility," Marcus said. "Board members present, investors present, media adjacent, compliance leadership present. He will believe the room belongs to him." Lena's face tightened when Evelyn told her, "You're going back there." "Yes, Ev. I know." "I don't think you do." Lena's voice broke, and Evelyn saw not doubt but fear. "That room destroyed you once." Evelyn looked at her friend for a long moment. "No, Adrian destroyed the person who walked into that room. I'm not bringing her back." Adrian's fear did not arrive all at once. Evelyn saw it develop in stages through the reports Marcus collected and the tremors moving through the industry. First came irritation. He told people that governance reviews were political theater, and that a disgruntled former employee had found sympathetic ears among compliance obsessives. Then came containment. He called former allies, asked who had been contacted, who had spoken, who had copies of old files, and his questions were wrapped in friendliness so thin that even loyalists began to feel the blade beneath it. Then came suspicion. He stopped trusting assistants. He demanded meeting notes be destroyed after calls. He asked one former colleague whether Evelyn had approached them, and when they said no, he did not believe them. Finally came fear. Fear appeared when he stopped trying to shape the story and began trying to discover how much of the story had escaped him. By then it was already too late. Lena remained the only person who could still say Evelyn's name like it belonged to a human being rather than a cautionary force. They met every other Sunday in a small cafe far from the financial district, and Lena talked about ordinary things deliberately: bad dates, her upstairs neighbor's piano lessons, the office plants dying after facilities changed vendors, but sometimes the conversation returned to Northbridge because wounds had gravity. One afternoon Lena admitted she had almost stood up during the accusation meeting. She had imagined it, she said, pushing back her chair, saying "This is wrong," demanding the logs be reviewed. But then she saw Adrian looking at the room, not angrily, just watching, and she froze because she had rent, parents, loans, fear. Evelyn listened without rescuing her. That was new too. The old Evelyn would have comforted, absolved, made it easier. The new Evelyn let the discomfort remain until Lena whispered, "I should have done more," and Evelyn said, "Yes." It hurt them both, but truth often did. The summit was held in the same building where Evelyn had been escorted out, though on a higher floor, in the glass atrium reserved for clients and investors. October light poured through the windows, making the city look clean and distant. Evelyn arrived in a black suit, hair neat, face composed, carrying a slim leather folder and nothing else. She did not enter through the main reception line. Marcus had arranged access through an investor ethics group, now reviewing Northbridge's governance exposure. Her name appeared on the guest list under Consultant Risk Integrity Review. Nobody at the front desk recognized her immediately. That helped. Inside, the atrium hummed with expensive confidence. Men and women in tailored clothing spoke softly over coffee. Board members clustered near the windows. Northbridge executives wore the alert smiles of hosts, watching money move through a room. Evelyn saw faces from her old life and felt their recognition ripple unevenly. First confusion, then discomfort, then calculation. A few looked away. One former colleague stared as if seeing a ghost, who had learned to dress better. Lena stood near the side entrance, pale but steady. She gave Evelyn the smallest nod. Adrian was on stage, halfway through his presentation. He looked almost unchanged. That surprised her less than it should have. Men like Adrian preserved themselves by transferring damage outward. His suit was perfect. His voice was warm. Behind him, slides displayed growth curves, client retention, disciplined risk management, and Vesper as a flagship success. He spoke about trust. He spoke about transparency. He spoke about the importance of building cultures where truth could reach leadership quickly. Evelyn felt nothing for several seconds, and that emptiness confirmed she was ready. The first sign that something was wrong came when a board member received a message, looked down and stopped smiling. Then another. Then the general counsel lined toward Ms. Reynolds, who had aged visibly since the morning Evelyn was fired. A quiet movement passed through the front row. Adrian continued speaking, but his eyes flicked toward them once, then back to the audience. He sensed disturbance, not fear yet, just irritation. Marcus stood from the second row during the cue and apportion. Mr. Cole, before investor questions proceed, there is a governance matter that must be addressed. Adrian's smile tightened. Marcus Hale, I didn't realize you were attending. I'm aware. A small ripple moved through the room. Adrian's eyes shifted, searching, and then found Evelyn. There it was, the first true crack. It lasted less than a second, but Evelyn saw it. Recognition, disbelief, and beneath both, something smaller, quicker, more animal. Fear not yet formed, but awakened. Evelyn stood. Dead silence arrived faster than any sound could have. Conversations stopped. Cups paused halfway to mouths. Phones lowered. The room remembered her now not as a person, but as a scandal returning in human form. Ms. Reynolds rose from her chair. Evelyn, this is not an appropriate forum. Evelyn turned to her calmly. It was considered appropriate when I was accused in one. No one moved. Marcus stepped aside, and Evelyn walked to the front with no hurry, because hurry would have looked like desperation, and she had not come to beg. Adrian remained near the podium, one hand resting lightly on the edge, his posture still controlled. Only the tendons in his jaw betrayed him. Evelyn, he said softly, using the old tone, the one that once made rooms believe him. Whatever unresolved concerns you have, this is not the way. She looked at him. You taught me that public narratives matter. His hand tightened on the podium. The first strike was simple. Original documents, version histories, calendar records, mating logs, travel receipts. She did not accuse at first, she displayed. The screen behind her, now controlled by Marcus through the Summit AV system, with authorization from the governance committee, showed the fabricated access timeline next to verified records, proving she could not have performed the alleged exports. A murmur moved through the room, then died as she moved to the next slide. Metadata from the manipulated Vesper files, administrative session traces, a temporary directory screenshot, the partial executive analytics pathway. Adrian interrupted. This is highly technical material being presented without context. Evelyn nodded. Correct. So I brought context. Second strike, emails, his message telling her not to worry about the temp folder, his request for raw model assumptions, his edits to the client story removing risk flags, comparison between her original risk assessment and the final investor-facing version. Each change highlighted, each time-stamped, each linked to access routes outside her account. The silence changed. It was no longer shock. It became comprehension. Adrian turned toward the board. This is a selective reconstruction by a former employee with an obvious grievance. Evelyn clicked to the next slide. The delighted memo appeared, reframing risk ownership, preparing a personnel explanation if projection integrity is challenged. Adrian stopped breathing for one visible second. That was the moment he understood the room was no longer his. The final strike did not involve her firing. It involved Caldwell Meridian. Evelyn laid out the structure with cold care, not overstating, not dramatizing, because the truth needed no decoration. Advisory vehicle, beneficial links, timing of positions, Northbridge recommendations, Vesper valuation movements, internal risk suppression, Adrian's communications with external intermediaries. The general counsel stood halfway through, face white. A board member whispered something harsh to another. An investor in the front row closed his notebook slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might implicate him. Adrian tried denial first. "I have no financial relationship with Caldwell Meridian." Evelyn displayed a filing. He shifted. "That entity is not controlled by me." She displayed correspondence. He swallowed. "Those materials are privileged." Marcus spoke then, not when used to conceal misconduct. Adrian looked at Marcus, then at Evelyn, and the mask finally broke. Not completely, but enough. His eyes changed. The charisma fell away, and what remained was the man beneath, cornered, furious, frightened, and unused to being seen without protection. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said, no longer softly enough to seem kind. Evelyn looked at him in the silence he had once used against her. "I know exactly what I'm doing." The board suspended him before the summit ended, not publicly at first. Publicly, they announced an immediate governance review and postponed the remainder of the program. Privately, security escorted Adrian through a side corridor, not the main lobby, because powerful men are granted discreet exits even when exposed. Evelyn watched from near the glass wall as he was led away. He did not look at the floor. He did not look at the guards. He looked at her, and in that look she saw the full arrival of fear. Not fear of losing money, not fear of embarrassment, fear of reversal, fear of having created someone outside his control. The investigation expanded within days. Northbridge issued a statement. Investors demanded independent review. Journalists began circling. Regulators requested documents. Former employees found courage after the danger had already shifted. Priya gave a statement. Mark authenticated the old pattern. Lena testified to meeting timelines. Marcus delivered the case architecture with a calm that made executives sweat. Adrian resigned before he could be formally terminated, which fooled nobody. His speaking engagements vanished. His advisory roles were suspended. People who had once returned his calls within minutes began routing him through assistant. The industry did not love justice. It loved distance from liability. Evelyn's name was cleared in the formal review, but vindication felt nothing like she had imagined. There was no sudden restoration of the person she had been. Northbridge offered compensation, reinstatement, and later, under pressure from the board, a senior advisory position in its rebuilt risk integrity function. She declined reinstatement and accepted a settlement large enough to be called confidential by people who preferred not to say embarrassing. She kept working with Marcus. Then she built her own firm, not quickly, not brightly, but with the controlled precision of someone who understood that influence mattered more when it did not announce itself. Companies began hiring her quietly to find the things men like Adrian hid. Her reputation changed, not back to what it was, into something else. People no longer called her promising. They called her careful, dangerous, unemotional, effective. Former colleagues who had avoided her now sent messages full of admiration and regret. As she answered few, some opportunists tried to attach themselves to her rising name. She ignored them all. Lena remained. Marcus remained. Everyone else became context. The first major client who hired Evelyn's new firm did not hire her because they admired justice. They hired her because they were afraid. A health technology company had discovered irregularities in its investor reporting and wanted someone outside the usual consulting circles, someone with no patience for executive theater. Evelyn walked into their boardroom with Marcus beside her and watched three senior men try to perform transparency while hiding from one another. She recognized the pattern instantly. The vague answers, the polished concern, the casual minimization of discrepancies that could become crimes if named too clearly. She asked for raw access logs, not summaries. She asked for original files, not prepared decks. She asked every executive the same timeline questions separately and watched the lies drift apart. By the end of the third day, the board chair looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and alarm, because she had not raised her voice once, and still everyone in the building knew something was coming apart. There were nights when the transformation frightened her, not because she regretted what had happened to Adrian, but because control had become easier than softness. She found herself measuring everyone in terms of risk, motive, vulnerability, leverage. A new acquaintance mentioned an upcoming promotion, and Evelyn automatically wondered who benefited if it failed. A man at a charity dinner complimented her work, and she noticed his wedding ring indentation before she registered his smile. Her mind had become a room full of locked cabinets, every observation filed, every inconsistency preserved. Once, after Lena joked that Evelyn could probably make a priest confess to parking violations, Evelyn laughed and then went quiet because she realized the joke was only funny because it was close to true. She had become useful to a world built on fear, and usefulness had harmed her once before. The final regulatory notice against Adrian did not mention Evelyn by name. That was appropriate. The public document listed misleading investor materials, undisclosed conflicts, failure to supervise, obstruction of internal review, and improper alteration of risk documentation. It was bloodless language for a bloodletting. Adrian was barred from certain advisory roles pending further review. His civil exposure multiplied. His old network issued formal statements about confidence in governance, while quietly erasing photographs, biographies, panel recordings, anything that tied them too closely to his rise. Evelyn read the notice at her desk at dawn while rain tapped against the windows, and she waited for satisfaction to arrive. It did not. What came instead was a familiar emptiness, cleaner than grief but not kinder. Marcus called 10 minutes later and said, "It's done." Evelyn looked at the grey morning and answered, "No, it's recorded." Marcus understood the difference. Months later, at a private governance conference in Boston, Evelyn noticed people lowering their voices when she approached, not out of dislike, out of caution. A partner from a major firm moved away from a conversation the moment she joined it, leaving his drink behind. A chief operating officer who had once ignored her email about Vespa now greeted her with excessive warmth and introduced her to his board chair as one of the sharpest integrity minds in the industry. Evelyn smiled politely and watched him sweat. She understood then that fear had become part of her professional currency. She could spend it, save it, or allow it to grow on its own. That night, alone in her hotel room, she removed her earrings, placed them beside the sink, and looked at herself beneath the unforgiving bathroom light. The woman in the mirror looked composed, successful, untouchable, and very far away. Adrian tried to rebuild once. People like him always did. He announced a boutique advisory practice through a carefully worded post about resilience, lessons, and moving forward after a difficult chapter. Within 48 hours, 2 prospective clients received anonymous, but fully sourced risk summaries outlining his unresolved regulatory exposure. Evelyn did not send them. She did not need to. The ecosystem had learned the pattern. People who had once feared Adrian now feared being seen protecting him. That was the true reversal. Power had migrated. His name had become what hers once was, a contamination risk, a whispered concern, a reason to decline politely. When he realized the doors were not just closed but closing before he reached them, he began leaving messages through intermediaries, not apologizing, never apologizing, but asking for a truce. Evelyn never responded. A truce required 2 sides still at war. She had moved beyond him. The final confrontation happened 6 months after the summit, in the underground parking garage of a private office tower, where Evelyn had just finished a meeting with a board committee that wanted her to assess internal misconduct risk before a merger. She walked toward her car and saw Adrian standing near the concrete pillar beside it, thinner than before, still well-dressed but no longer immaculate. His face had sharpened. His confidence had become something brittle. "I waited because your assistant said you'd refuse a meeting," he said. "I would have." His mouth twitched. "You've become difficult to reach." "No, I've become selective." He laughed once without humor. "Do you know what you did to me?" Evelyn stopped several feet away. The garage smelled of oil, concrete, and rainwater dragged in by tires. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. There were cameras in every corner. She had already noticed them. "I showed people what you did," she said. "You destroyed my life." "No, I returned it to you." His expression cracked at that, anger rising through exhaustion. "You think you're clean. You think this makes you better than me. You spent months building a machine to ruin me." "Yes." The honesty stopped him. Evelyn continued, calm and flat. "You should understand that better than anyone. The difference is you built yours out of lies. I built mine out of proof." He stared at her. For the first time since she had known him, Adrian Cole looked uncertain, not about strategy, not about optics, but about the person standing in front of him. "What did you become?" he asked, and his voice had lost its polish. "What the hell did you become?" Evelyn looked at him and felt the old pain move somewhere deep inside her, not gone, not healed, but sealed behind something stronger. She thought of the bathroom floor, the cardboard box, the elevator doors, the silence after her name turned toxic. She thought of the woman who had walked out of Northbridge, believing she had lost everything. That woman had not returned. She never would. Someone you should have never tried to destroy, Evelyn said. She walked past him, unlocked her car, and drove out of the garage without looking back. There was no celebration that night, no champagne, no triumphant call. She went home to an apartment larger and quieter than the one she had nearly lost, removed her shoes, placed her keys in a ceramic dish, and stood for a long time in the dark living room without turning on the lights. The city moved beyond the windows, indifferent and bright. Her phone held 3 new messages from people requesting meetings, 2 from companies in trouble, and 1 from a board member who had once ignored her warning about Vesper. Power had found her now, but it did not feel warm. It felt like standing behind glass, untouched, but unable to forget the cost of becoming untouchable. Lena called near midnight. Evelyn answered. "Are you okay?" Lena asked. Evelyn looked at her reflection in the window. Calm face, still eyes. A woman Adrian would not have recognized until it was too late. "No," she said honestly, "but I'm in control." Lena was quiet for a moment. "Is that enough?" Evelyn watched the city lights blur faintly through the glass. "It has to be." After they hung up, Evelyn opened the folder on her desk labeled Northbridge and removed the first document inside, the printed slide from the morning of her accusation. Fraud, misconduct, internal breach, her old name beneath false charges. She did not tear it up. She did not burn it. She placed it back carefully, because evidence mattered, memory mattered, and forgetting was a luxury she no longer trusted. She turned off the lamp and let the apartment fall into darkness. In the industry, people would later tell the story differently depending on what they needed it to mean. Some said Evelyn Shaw was brilliant. Some said she was ruthless. Some said Adrian Cole had underestimated the wrong woman. Some lowered their voices when they mentioned her, not because she shouted, not because she threatened, but because she had proven that silence could be a weapon, patience could be a blade, and destruction could be survived so completely that the survivor became the thing powerful people checked for in the dark before making their next move. Evelyn did not correct them. She had no interest in being understood by people who only respected outcomes. She had learned the final truth of power, and it was colder than victory. Destruction does not end a person when something inside them refuses to die. It removes softness. It burns away the need to be believed immediately. It teaches the value of timing, evidence, leverage, and silence. Adrian had thought he was ending her when he stood in that conference hall and made the room turn against her. He had not ended her. He had removed every reason she had left to be gentle with men like him. Years later, people still used Adrian Cole's name as shorthand in closed rooms, a warning about executive charm, unchecked authority, and the danger of assuming quiet employees were powerless. Evelyn's name was used differently, sometimes as an expert, sometimes as a threat, sometimes by people who had never met her, as a ghost story told to ambitious men who believed documentation was beneath them. "Be careful," they would say. "There are Evelyn Shaws now." She heard the phrase once at a conference from 2 junior analysts who did not recognize her standing behind them. One said it with admiration, the other said it with fear. Evelyn walked past without introducing herself, carrying coffee she did not need, and felt the faintest movement of something like amusement, not joy. Joy belonged to earlier versions of life. This was colder, but it was hers. At home that evening, she opened the old Northbridge folder one final time. The accusation slide was still there. The Vesper timeline, Adrian's delighted memo, Lena's calendar exports, Marcus's first handwritten notes, the regulatory notice, the settlement letter. The documents no longer hurt in the same way, but they had not become harmless. They were artifacts from the death of oneself and the construction of another. Evelyn placed them back in order and locked the folder away. Then she stood by the window while the city moved below, bright and indifferent, and understood that transformation was not recovery. Recovery implied returning. She would never return. Adrian had destroyed the woman who wanted to be trusted, believed, included, valued by rooms that had never deserved her. What remained was not healed, not gentle, not broken either. What remained was deliberate. That was the part no one understood when they called it revenge. Revenge was too small a word for the architecture of becoming. Adrian had given her humiliation, isolation, and ruin, believing those things would make her disappear. Instead, they became materials. She used the humiliation to shed shame. She used isolation to study. She used ruin to learn which parts of her were real and which had only been built to survive other people's approval. By the time she returned, she was not returning for apology or restoration. She was returning as consequence, and consequences do not need to scream. They arrive documented, timed, inevitable, and cold. The months of rebuilding were filled with small humiliations that never appeared in any official record. Evelyn carried that lesson into every room afterward, not as a slogan but as a method, because what had happened to her had stripped away the comforting fiction that truth naturally rose to the surface. Truth had to be preserved. Truth had to be organized. Truth had to be delivered at the moment when denial became expensive. She learned to watch faces while people lied, to notice the tiny delay before a rehearsed answer, to hear the difference between confusion and performance, to let silence stretch until another person filled it with a mistake. Every new case she accepted became a mirror of the old one in some smaller way, and every time she watched another executive choose image over integrity, she felt the old conference room return around her, the slide, the lights, the eyes, the door closing. She did not let those memories weaken her anymore. She used them like coordinates. They told her where the danger lived. Marcus taught Evelyn that powerful people rarely feared morality, but always feared documentation. Evelyn carried that lesson into every room afterward, not as a slogan but as a method, because what had happened to her had stripped away the comforting fiction that truth naturally rose to the surface. Truth had to be preserved. Truth had to be organized. Truth had to be delivered at the moment when denial became expensive. She learned to watch faces while people lied, to notice the tiny delay before a rehearsed answer, to hear the difference between confusion and performance, to let silence stretch until another person filled it with a mistake. Every new case she accepted became a mirror of the old one in some smaller way, and every time she watched another executive choose image over integrity, she felt the old conference room return around her, the slide, the lights, the eyes, the door closing. She did not let those memories weaken her anymore. She used them like coordinates. They told her where the danger lived. Lena remained a reminder that loyalty could survive fear, but could not erase it. Evelyn carried that lesson into every room afterward, not as a slogan but as a method, because what had happened to her had stripped away the comforting fiction that truth naturally rose to the surface. Truth had to be preserved. Truth had to be organized. Truth had to be delivered at the moment when denial became expensive. She learned to watch faces while people lied, to notice the tiny delay before a rehearsed answer, to hear the difference between confusion and performance, to let silence stretch until another person filled it with a mistake. Every new case she accepted became a mirror of the old one in some smaller way, and every time she watched another executive choose image over integrity, she felt the old conference room return around her, the slide, the lights, the eyes, the door closing. She did not let those memories weaken her anymore. She used them like coordinates. They told her where the danger lived. Adrian's collapse was not a single explosion, but a sequence of doors closing one after another. Evelyn carried that lesson into every room afterward, not as a slogan but as a method, because what had happened to her had stripped away the comforting fiction that truth naturally rose to the surface. Truth had to be preserved. Truth had to be organized. Truth had to be delivered at the moment when denial became expensive. She learned to watch faces while people lied, to notice the tiny delay before a rehearsed answer, to hear the difference between confusion and performance, to let silence stretch until another person filled it with a mistake. Every new case she accepted became a mirror of the old one in some smaller way, and every time she watched another executive choose image over integrity, she felt the old conference room return around her, the slide, the lights, the eyes, the door closing. She did not let those memories weaken her anymore. She used them like coordinates. They told her where the danger lived. The new Evelyn did not feel victorious as much as precise. Evelyn carried that lesson into every room afterward, not as a slogan but as a method, because what had happened to her had stripped away the comforting fiction that truth naturally rose to the surface. Truth had to be preserved. Truth had to be organized. Truth had to be delivered at the moment when denial became expensive. She learned to watch faces while people lied, to notice the tiny delay before a rehearsed answer, to hear the difference between confusion and performance, to let silence stretch until another person filled it with a mistake. Every new case she accepted became a mirror of the old one in some smaller way, and every time she watched another executive choose image over integrity, she felt the old conference room return around her, the slide, the lights, the eyes, the door closing. She did not let those memories weaken her anymore. She used them like coordinates. They told her where the danger lived. By the time the industry feared her, she understood fear was only another form of memory. Evelyn carried that lesson into every room afterward, not as a slogan but as a method, because what had happened to her had stripped away the comforting fiction that truth naturally rose to the surface. Truth had to be preserved. Truth had to be organized. Truth had to be delivered at the moment when denial became expensive. She learned to watch faces while people lied, to notice the tiny delay before a rehearsed answer, to hear the difference between confusion and performance, to let silence stretch until another person filled it with a mistake. Every new case she accepted became a mirror of the old one in some smaller way, and every time she watched another executive choose image over integrity, she felt the old conference room return around her, the slide, the lights, the eyes, the door closing. She did not let those memories weaken her anymore. She used them like coordinates. They told her where the danger lived, and in the end, that was what Adrian feared most. Not that Evelyn Shaw had destroyed him, not that she had exposed him, not that she had turned his own systems against him. What he feared most was the truth he could never undo. He had created the very thing that ended him.